Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. Our guests today are Meg Lundsager and Kent Hughes. Meg is a Wilson Center Public Policy Fellow and is a former U.S. Executive Director for the International Monetary Fund. Kent is also a Wilson Public Policy Fellow and is the former Director of the Program on America and the Global Economy. Those are the long versions. I could have just said, and these are two people who know a lot about money and will share their insights with us today. We're going to talk about the global economy and the U.S. economy. And forgive me for going a little gimmicky to start off, but I want you to both think of a number between 1 and 10. 1 being we are ready to go over the fiscal cliff, 10 being economy hitting on all cylinders. And what is your score for the global economy on that 1 to 10 scale? Meg?
I'd put it at a 4 to 5, and basically it's not quite going over a cliff, but there are a lot of worries in terms of what could cause a major slowdown. And that's because there are several parts of the world where growth has slowed significantly. Europe, even China, the United States is not growing as robustly as it was. And it's unclear where the impetus to stronger growth is going to come from. And I say this despite the really very accommodative, as we say, monetary policies across the board. I mean, the ECB is moving again to expand its stimulus. The Fed has been pretty generous too with monetary policy, and we're not getting big boosts for growth out of that.
Professor Hughes, I know when you taught your course in recent years, students wouldn't be happy with a 4 out of 10. What would be your grade?
Well, I'm close to where Meg is, and adding a good degree of uncertainty. What will China do? In the past, when China faces a slowing economy, they stimulate. That made a big difference when we had the financial crisis. The same is true of some of the European countries. While Germany is hitting, from their point of view, a rough patch right now, they really have capacity to spend more, and they could use it. So I would, to some extent, think that their fate and our fate really are in fiscal policy hands.
When you say spend more, are we past austerity as the answer to the global economy's problems?
Yes and no. And I say yes because the U.S. certainly is nowhere near any kind of austerity. And we have very high budget deficits, and there's really no downward trend in those deficits going forward. In Europe, they do have the capacity, as Kent was just saying, Germany especially, to spend a lot more. And the finance minister recently said, I'm ready to spend billions and billions of euros to protect the German economy, get it going. But Angela Merkel, the outgoing chancellor, has also said, not really.
Well, she was more part of the austerity crowd.
Yeah, she was more part of the austerity crowd, more cautious. They have baked in rules that limit how much debt the government can take on, even though there are ways to get around that. But in Germany, they're so deeply intertwined with the rest of the Eurozone. When they don't grow very much, it really hurts the rest of the economy there. But they don't necessarily own up to that direct link, and certainly not ordinary German citizens. They don't really see that.
Kent, is there a particular European economy that, so goes that country, so goes the EU?
Well, again, I really put the emphasis on Germany. And one of the interesting features is that Germany, like us, has become very involved in China. If anything, they're more dependent on exports to China. So if China does, in fact, decide to stimulate, that will be good news for Germany. If it's good news for Germany, then the question is, can they be persuaded to play the locomotive role in Europe? They have, as Meg says, they've been reluctant to do it. They would say we've got an aging economy, we really need to harbor our resources and so forth. Germans themselves save a lot, and they are reluctant to go into debt. Credit cards are not popular there the way they are here. How many credit cards do you have? Most Americans, 4 or 5. So it's a question of, can Germany, which does have a commitment to Europe and keeping the European Union going, can they change their approach? It's a big question. Here, as Meg points out, we're flirting with trillion-dollar deficits as far as the eye can see. So you say, well, what room do we have for a fiscal stimulus? Well, if we chose to do it, we would not want to just randomly cut taxes. We want to have a real investment agenda, thinking of infrastructure across the country, investments that over the long term stimulate growth and add to productivity. So we could do some things, but we are in a situation where if there were a serious recession, people would be shocked that we're going to go further in debt. We're going to have to take on that deficit and debt at some point in the future.
Well, let's run with that a little bit. You know, the deficits used to be the center of the political debate in the United States, that we really needed to tame the deficit. And now there's this almost nonchalant approach to deficits, coming from both parties, frankly.
No, I share that sense, and I agree. It's a little worrisome, and I agree with Kent that it's going to come back to bite us one day. The thing is, in the United States, because it's so easy for us to issue debt, and the rest of the world buys and sells Treasury debt all the time for their own reasons, it's very easy to finance these deficits, and interest rates are still very low in the United States. But with that said, it seems to reach a political limit before an economic limit. So when there's a big election coming up, whatever, there'll be criticisms of whoever's ramped up the deficit. And so I'm sure that'll come back next year, but nonetheless, I don't think it's going to lead to the kind of policies that would reverse that. And it's very hard to turn around and raise taxes. The one thing that's very puzzling, coming back to Kent's point about the long run, is there's a big corporate tax cut. While we've seen some strengthening of investment in some areas, it's been a really disappointing result in terms of money coming back to the United States and being invested in long-term plant and equipment, technology, a lot of research and development. We just haven't seen all that, and it's a little puzzling why that big tax cut for the corporate sector didn't generate that kind of result. So I don't know what, I mean, in terms of personal tax cuts, I mean, there really isn't much left to do.
Are there any deficit hawks left standing?
Well, I would say that Governor Sanford, former governor of South Carolina, is building his case for running against the president on the deficit and the debt. But he is a lonely voice. What used to be standard, really Republican and conservative doctrine just seems to have been completely muffled.
Well, then exacerbated by the Tea Party movement, which similarly seems to have gone away in that regard.
Yes, it really is surprising. And one of the things that hasn't been paid attention to is if we found interest rates going back up to what we would think of as a normal level, with this enormous debt, that would start being a major element in every year's budget. So you would find interest payments perhaps squeezing out investments in education or research or other long-term growth-generating investments.
Meg's score for the global economy, about a 4 or a 5 perhaps, or 3, somewhere in that 3 to 5 range. You said you agree without committing to a number. I noticed that you did not.
I was just being a little sneaky on that.
I made a note. But let's isolate the U.S. economy, and we keep hearing that the fundamentals are strong. What is the score for the U.S. economy?
Well, the U.S. economy is actually doing okay these days. I mean, the unemployment rate is decades low level. Growth is okay. It's not great.
Is okay 7, 8 as far as hitting on all cylinders?
No, it's like 2%. It's growth
no, I
is
don't mean
about 2%
of growth. I mean on the scale of.
I would say 6-ish, let's say, because there's potential for more growth because we're not getting that long-term investment that would add to productivity and generate future growth. But we also have an aging population, an aging workforce. So you're seeing more retirees all the time. Bigger drain on the deficit, by the way. But it's also and we're limiting immigration, so it's going to be hard to see where the growth in the labor force is going to come from. And we've already had many stories in the press that we've seen in terms of a lot of industries are desperate to get skilled labor, and they can't find it.
And when the labor force grows, the tax base grows.
Absolutely,
along with it.
Yes.
So that when people say, from the president on down, that the fundamentals are strong, what are they talking about? What does that mean?
Well, they're looking at the unemployment rate. They're looking at the growth rate, which is not spectacular, but certainly 2% still looks pretty good to people. Yeah. They're looking at the stock market, which no matter what happens in the world, it seems to flirt with a new record high. So all of these easy metrics look pretty good. None of them necessarily forecast the long term, as Meg was pointing out. I think the I would probably give the U.S. economy a little bit higher rating. And the question is, will we see rising wages? We're seeing for the first time a little bit increase in the real wage. Will that in turn pressure companies to make the kind of investments that we haven't yet seen? That innovation, and first thing you should do is raise wages. If that starts as a pressure on you, then you innovate. So one of the things that I worry about looking long term is the impact of artificial intelligence on the employment. And if that's has half the impact that the more concerned estimates suggest, we're going to have a real major adjustment in the labor force. So we could be doing so many things. Companies can't invest in training the way they used to because they're in a global economy. They're competing with different systems and different companies. But if we link them to our community colleges, which could make an enormous contribution to training and skill upgrading, there's a lot of things we could do that we're just not doing.
Since everybody likes a quick fix, which is sometimes part of the problem, what could we do now in the short term that would be a very positive step? Is it something like a trade deal with China? What are the things that are within the realm of possibility that you would recommend?
Well, certainly resolving some of these trade issues, I think, would be a big boost to confidence. I mean, we're seeing now all these uncertainty indexes produced by different analysts showing how much that's reducing global growth, national growth, because of the fear element, not the uncertainty, not knowing what's going to happen. So you're not getting the investment. You're not getting as much hiring as you might otherwise. So I do think resolving the trade dispute with China would be the number one way of basically restoring confidence sort of across our economy and certainly in the Chinese economy. I mean, what's interesting is even though their trade surplus in China's gone up, overall, it's because they're importing a lot less. That has very little help, adds very little to global growth because China's such a big economy right now. You want their imports to be going up from everybody year after year after year, and already this year they're in the negative territory.
Meg, how much of the health of an economy is a function of this intangible thing, this thing that isn't real?
Well, that's very hard to get a real concrete measure of, but the New York Fed has been doing some work on this, the IMF, others, and they use all sorts of different ways of looking at the worry element in terms of the business community or consumers, and they go on the basis of news articles or various sets of indicators, and we're starting to see more and more of this concern. And so far, the U.S. consumer has been doing their job.
Yeah. And it's interesting in that people often think about this as math and very complex, and then economists continue to introduce this consumer confidence and things that aren't math.
Yeah, it's the human element. How are people going to feel? And we'll see this come, the holiday buying season. First of all, we'll see how much of the tariffs get passed through to the consumer. But also, do people get a little more cautious on spending if they're worried about, all this uncertainty, I'm not sure how secure my job is this next year. Let's just be a little cautious. We'll have to wait and see.
So stabilizing the trade environment is what Meg would do in the short term. Kent, you get the unenviable task of going second. So even if that's your first choice, we need to hear something else.
Well, I would just add that the president has already indicated he's delaying certain tariffs on Chinese goods till December 15th. So Santa Claus is not going to be affected. I think that I would like to see a genuine announcement of a long-term development strategy, set some economic priorities for the country.
You mentioned the I word earlier, infrastructure. Is that part of it?
Absolutely. I think if you had a credible announcement of new infrastructure in the right places, you would find private investment anticipating opportunity and already moving in that direction. We have got to do all of those things, and it takes a bit of adjustment in how we think about the economy. We've been blessed with wonderful companies and so forth, and government support to some extent. And suddenly we face a challenge from China, which operates on a totally different basis. And they have a long-term strategy. If you read The China Dream by Colonel Liu Mingfu, a veteran of the People's Liberation Army, his bottom line is the age of hegemons is over, meaning the U.S., and China will be number one. And that's their aspiration. And we need to think seriously about we make the right kind of strategy ourselves and the right kind of investments that make sure that our values, our interests are protected in the world.
At the risk of ending our discussion on an alarmist note, since both of you gave the U.S. economy fairly high marks, particularly in contrast to the global economy, I want to know what keeps you up at night. What is the either canary in the mine shaft that you're hearing starting to sing, or what is the thing that worries you that our 6 or 7 or 8 or whatever our score is could start to drop?
Well, to be quite honest, I'm really worried about climate change. And in part, it's seeing all the fires last year in California, not so many this year.
Hard to budget for Category 5 hurricanes.
Yeah, the hurricanes are just an absolute nightmare. The human toll, the toll on communities, and we are just not prepared. And if we're going to see even much larger migration in the coming years, and I don't mean 100 years from now, I mean in the next 5, 10 years, we are just unprepared for that. And how are we going to handle it? And it won't just be, the other side of the world. It'll be going on in the United States. And we're already seeing that in many communities. Just an ordinary high tide, the streets flood.
Yeah, and we can stop talking about the possibility of these outcomes. They're happening.
They're happening already. And
what you're talking about is responsible planning and reaction to
Yeah, now communities are doing that to the extent they can, but you need a federal approach to make it work, to have the allocation, to have the kind of infrastructure investment that helps us deal with that.
Kent, what has you tossing and turning?
Well, I think about the demographic projections, which say by 2050 there may be 2 billion more people here. It feeds into Meg's concern about waves of immigration when you combine it with the impact of climate change. So I think we really need to wonder how in the world are we going to feed, clothe, provide decent water and health care and so forth. And this brings us back to how do we deal with China and other big economies. China's a rival. We need to think about how to compete. But if you look at the list of global challenges where we are all going to have to cooperate, it's going to be a challenge for us to learn how to both cooperate and compete at the same time.
Kent Hughes, Meg Lundsager, thank you very much for helping us sort through the complexities and making some sense of all of this. We'll hope for the positive outcomes, right?
Thank
Prepare
you.
for the negative, but hope
for the positive. Thank you.
Right. Thanks to all of you for joining us as well. Hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon, either video version or the podcast version. We'd like to have you. I'm John Molesky. Thanks for watching.